So hello and welcome everyone to this new video about front-end development using JavaScript, HTML and CSS. In the previous videos, we saw how we can use HTML, CSS to render a beautiful page, and then we used JavaScript to make our web page responsive. So all the code that we wrote in the previous tutorials will run on the client side, namely in a browser, and that's called front end. So in this tutorial we'll be breaking the rules here and we will be writing a backend, although the name of our series called front end development. That's why, because I feel that we need to know a little bit what's going on the backend, so I will not go in details. It will be only this tutorial. So in this tutorial I will be using node.js to write the backend. Let me start clarifying the client server paradigm. So in the client server paradigm we have a server which provide content to the client. Client is, for example, a web browser on your laptop, on your mobile devices, or on your PC. These clients will issue an HTTP request, usually HTTP GET, to get a web page. This is how we usually address a web page. So we use the HTTP request or HTTPS sometimes. Then we have the address of the website, and then we have here in the rest some parameters which will help the server to know which page or which service we are requesting. In this tutorial, we'll be using a URL which looks like this here. So we will have the local host, since our server will be running on the same PC, and we will have this colon here and then a number. I will be using 3000, which is the port number. The port is a way to enable the server to run multiple services. So maybe you want to run not only one website, for example, using Node.js, the websites which we'll be doing today to deal with the list of our physicists. So maybe you want to run another web server which handle a to-do list, or maybe a hotel booking website, or maybe evaluation website, or anything else. To do that, you can run multiple applications, as we will see in Node.js or in any other environment, and each one of these applications will have different port. And then if you want to talk to a certain one, then you use the certain port used by this application. So having the correct address sent to the server will get this request, prepare a response, and send it back to you. So for example, if this was a web page, it will return an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which the web browser can run and render the page for you. We will see also in this tutorial another kind of request. It's still an HTTP request, and in this request we will be using a type which is get or post. The get usually used to get some data from the server or to send the server some data. So we have our physicist lists and we want maybe to get only this list, not a whole page, and then we send the server a get request, for example, to give us only this list. You can see here the URL will stay maybe the same. We're using the same port. However, here this part of the URL will be changing. Maybe here we will have something like physicists to inform the server that please return for us the list of the physicists that you have, and then the server will respond and send us the list of the physicists. In this tutorial we'll be using JSON to do that. So the list of the physicists will be sent back in this JSON format, which you can see here. This is one example for one physicist which written in JSON. So we have this curly brackets here, and then we have the different fields. For example, we had the field name, note here the double quotation, and then the colon, and then it comes the name, which is also put in quotation since it's a string. Then we have the birth year, which is a number, so there's no quotations, and similarly for the birthplace and the comments. I will not go in detail in the JSON format. Here we will be using it just to return the list of the physicists. In JavaScript, there are two commands which we can use on the client side, so in the web browser for JSON. So one called stringify, which will take a JavaScript object and return a JSON string, which represent this object. And the other one is json.parse, which will take a string and return a JavaScript object which represent the parsed JSON string. So returning back to the request tab, we have the get and post. The get will be used to get the list of the physicists, since we are getting something from the server, while we will use the post to tell the server to change this list, for example, to save a new physicist or update an existing one, or to delete a physicist. Remember, till now we were using this live server here as our backend. This live server is installed in our vscode as an extension, and we don't have much control there. However, in this tutorial we'll start writing our own server using node.js, so we don't need to use this run web page in live server, but we will be running our own JavaScript code on the server side, so our backend code using node.js. So let's start coding. So I already copied our website from the previous tutorial and put it in this folder vid11. If you remember, we have this web page. Let's run it for now in live server. In this web page we have this list of scientists. We've seen that we can select one of these physicists and we can change his informations. For example, let's change the comment here, then save them. As you can see here, you're also able to delete a scientist, and maybe add a new one. And remember that everything here is running in our web browser. So if we click refresh, the web browser will request the page again from the live server. The live server will send the original page where we have the list of the three scientists, which are Einstein, Maxwell, and Newton, and all our changes will be lost. So let's try that. I will click refresh, and you can see that the changes are lost. We will compare this later. We will finish our backend using the node.js. We will see that doing a refresh will not change, since our changes will be saved on the server side, on the node.js side. However, in this tutorial, we will not be using a database to save these changes. So basically, when we restart the server application, then again our changes are lost. But of course, not on a refresh, not on a client side action. That would be on a server side action, which is restarting the server. So let's start developing our backend. So let me open here a terminal. This is the folder, as you can see, which we're working on my PC. So if you remember from the first tutorials, we already talked about Node.js, and I show you how to install Node.js and the package manager npm. So now I already have Node.js installed and can run JavaScript files on my PC using the command node. I will now just say version, and you can see the version of the Node.js which is installed on my PC. And we also installed npm, which is the package manager, and let's say the version of that. Remember that we have already made this structure here. We have JavaScript common, which will be used in both client side and server side. And we have here the JavaScript for the client side. Let me now add a new folder for the JavaScript on the server side. I will call it SS for server side. And now inside the server side code, I will add a JavaScript file. I will call it db.js, and inside this file, I will be writing the code to handle our list of physicists, which we were handling previously here. And let me also add another folder. I will call it HTML, and this folder will contain the HTML pages. For now, we only have one HTML page, and here on the root folder, I will have one JavaScript file. I will call it index.js, and this will be our main server-side application. So we will run this file on Node.js. So here we can write normal JavaScript, what we used to use on the client side. However, here we don't have this document or window objects because those represents our web page on the web browser, and we don't have web browser here. So we cannot use document, for example, but there are also other functionality here which we can use. For example, run a server, we can list files and open files on our file system. We can connect to databases also. I mean, in this tutorial, we'll be not doing that since I don't want to go also to database development. I will still be using an array to save the list of our physicists. However, this list will be on the server side. For now, let's start with a simple hello Node.js application. I will just use console.log, and let's say hello Node.js. Now we save, and here now in the terminal we can write simply node and the name of the file which we want to run, so index.js, and run. And as you can see now, we get here hello Node.js. There is no browser involved here. We have a code which already run inside this terminal here, which is running on my PC, not in the web browser. So everything is server side here. So now I will jump directly to a more complex subject here, which is how to start a server here, which will serve our web browser. And for that, I will be using a package called Express, and installing packages for our server-side application can be done using this npm package manager. So we write simply npm I for install and then Express because we want to install Express, and we click enter and wait a little bit. As you can see here, there are two JSON files added. One of them is the packages, and this log contain a certain version of this packages file. This packages file is very simple. It will contain our dependencies, and we have now only one dependency, which is Express, and this string here represent the version of this dependency. We will mostly not be touching those files here, and notice that we also have now a new folder here called node models. This folder will also not be touching. Everything inside this folder will be handled by npm. So npm will see which packages we need. So for example, when we used npm iExpress, it took the Express and put all the required modules here. Now we already have Express installed. We can use it, but before we do that, we need to tell Node.js that we want to use Express, and for that we use require. So this is the server way to include JavaScript file in our main file. Remember, in the client side, for example, here in the home page, we use the script tag here, and as source we put the JavaScript file which we want to use. On the server side, we use this require, and then we put the name of the package. since this is a package installed here inside this node module. Or as for the physicist, for example, we will use, and let me put that also here now, we will use require, and we will put the path of this JavaScript file. So remember that the physicist is inside our GS common here, and inside this physicist we had this exports here, and we said in the previous tutorial that this export will be used here on the server side, and that's how it is done. So this require will introduce this exports, and our physicist will be appended to those. That's why I wrote here dot physicist. So this will be representing our class, and now this constant here that we defined can be used to instantiate a new physicist. Also here now in express, this constant here will be representing our express module. Now let's create our application, and for that we define a constant application, and we call the function express, and as you can see here, this function creates an express application. So now we have our express application. We need also to define a port for this application to run on, and I want to use 3000 for that. You can use other number if you want. Usually the numbers below 1000 are reserved for the OS, for the operating system. Any integer above that can be used. So let me put this here since it's a configuration. And since I know that we will be using JSON, I want to tell this express application to use JSON, and that's done by using the function use, and then we add to it express.json. So now we already created and configured our express application. Now we need to add routes here. So let me for now add one route, and we will use get. That's because our web browser will be sending a get request. The first get request which I want to handle is to get the home page. So I only, as you can see here, wrote the address of the page. And then the second parameter I want to use here is a function. This function will be called from express whenever we have a get request to the home page. This function takes two parameters. One of them is the request. So this is an object representing get request from the user, and a response. This represents the response that the Express server will send to the front end or the web browser. I want first to log a message that we already have a get home request. And the action which I will do here is to send our home page. So I will say response. So this is the response object, and it has a method called send file, as you can see here. And this method accepts the path of the file. So the file would be our home page, which is inside this HTML folder. So I will write html/home.html. That's it for now. Of course, we need to configure even more because this will send only our HTML page. But whenever we get a request for style sheets or JavaScript files which are required by this web page, remember that this web page have client-side JavaScript here, two files. These two requests will not be handled since we don't have any routes for them. But we will do that later. For now, I want to jump directly to starting the server. And for that, we use the function listen. So we are telling our application to listen to a certain port. So we will pass the port for that. Remember, our port variable contain now 3000. And then we can have here a function which will run when our server is already listening to the port. That's for this function now use the arrow expressions. And we will just put here that our server is listening port that our server is listening on. That's it. So let me save. And now let's run this application again using node index.js. You can see now we have our first message, hello node.js, and then the second message is server is running on port 3000. So let's send a request for this server from the web browser. So I said we will use localhost. So either you can use this IP address here for the localhost, which is a reserved IP address for the localhost, or we can simply write localhost. And then here we need the port number. We know that we are running on this port here. And then I need to remove this .html here and then click enter. It's not working. And so I can see two problems here. First, I forgot to call this function. And we also need to define the route for our request. And for that, we use here a second parameter, which is an object. We will add the route property, and we will use the current directory for that. And let's now rerun our node application, and then let's refresh our web page. So you can see now we get our web page. So we have these inputs here, the buttons, but we don't have the list here. We'll come to that later. And we get here a message called get home request. That's because this route here is called, and then these lines here are executed. So now I don't need this debug log here anymore. So we can remove this, and maybe we can even convert this function here all to an arrow function. Also here we don't need these curly brackets. And now let's start filling our DB class here, which will run on the server side. So I already prepared this class. Let me paste it here. As you can see, we start this class simply by using again this require. And for that, we want this physicist class as before, but notice the path here. Since we are inside this folder here called GSSS, we want first to go to the parent folder and then again inside gs.common. So we are one level up and then inside this one here, and then we are going to the physicist. Now we can create instances from physicist just using new, as you can see here. So for the DB, we will use a normal JavaScript class as on the client side. And again, this class will have a list of physicists, as you can see here in the constructor. So we are using this array literal expression here. And inside it, we're defining our three physicists exactly as before when we were having this on the client side. And again, here we also have the get by name, same as before, update and delete and get all. So basically there is no changes here. And the only thing I want to do is to add the export. So remember on the server side, we get this exports and we want to attach to it our DB class simply by putting .db and assigning to it our class here, DB. Let me save and let's include this class inside our main JS script, similar to what we did for the physicist. Now we can create an instance from this DB, and let's now handle a second GET request, which is getting the list of physicists. And for that, we will again here use an app get. So for the root, we will use simply /physicists, so plural, and then we will have our function which will handle the request. So remember, take two parameter request and response, and let's write it in the arrow style. And we'll use a try catch here, and in case of errors, we will simply send a certain response, and this response will have a status of 500, which indicate a generic error. And then we will use the function send of this response, and we will send just the error. Maybe if you're doing a professional website, you don't want to send the whole error because this could contain information which you don't want to expose to the client. But for now, let's not worry about that. And then inside this try, we want to send the list of the physicists. And for that, we simply use the response and then send db.all. So remember, this function will return the list of all physicists. And inside this function, send, this list will be converted to JSON and then sent as a response to the client. Let me save here and stop the server and then rerun it. And now in the web browser, we can, instead of home, we can write physicists and click enter. And you can see the response we got back from the server. This is the response. So it's a JSON string. This string start by this indexing bracket here and end up here also with a closing bracket. This means we have a list of objects, and this list of objects contain one object here for Einstein, and then a second one here for Maxwell till here, and then a third one for Newton. And note that each entry in this list is separated from the previous one by a comma. So this is very good, but that's not what we want. We want to have our list of physicists inside our home page, inside an HTML table. And for that, we need to send this request from our home HTML page and render our HTML table. And for that, we need to start now changing our client side JavaScript code, which is running here. So remember, inside the home page, we have this script tag here. And now, for example, we don't need this DB here class. Let me remove it. Now remember, we have this fill grid function, which was already calling db.getAll, fill the grid. And since now this is client side, we need to send a get request to the server, which will return the JSON string, and we need to parse this string and use it to render the grid. So we don't need this input anymore. And let's go to this function here, fill grid, and this function is inside this file here, fill grid. So let's remove this input, and let's here at the beginning send a request to the server. Let me use a function called getAll, and let me make this function takes as an input parameter another function callback. I will tell you the reason for this later. And we will use a try catch block here also. Now remember, this code is on the client side. So we have our banner defined here inside this home HTML page. So we can use it to display the error. And that's what I will do here inside this catch block. So I'm adding an error. Now let's do the get request, and for that we will use the function fetch, and this function will require an address. For the physicists, we're using the address physicists plural here, so that's what we will need to provide inside this fetch here, and that's it basically. So this function will return for us the response. So let's save this response inside a variable. Let's call it response. And now there's a concept in JavaScript which I did not explain yet, and this concept is asynchronous programming. So basically this function, for example, fetch, is asynchronous. That means when we call this function will send a request to the server, and then it will not block, it will return, and then the first line of code after this fetch will be executed. When the response of the server is returned, that could take some time, and then we could add a callback for fetch which will be called. I don't want to focus too much here on this paradigm of programming. This is called asynchronous programming. And if you want to wait for this fetch to finish to get the response of the server, then we can use a keyword in JavaScript called await. This is telling the web browser, wait till this fetch finish its execution, which means that the response is received from the server, and then this response will be saved inside our variable response here. Another thing which we want to do here, because we have this await function, our main function should be a synchronous function. That's why I had this callback here, because we are now asynchronous. So we will execute, and when we finish execute, we will call this callback here. I hope this is not very complicated. If you want more information, maybe you can check this web page here from Mozilla, where you can see how they talk about this async functions and the await keyword and so on. However, for now, I want you to think of it in a very easy way. So await means please execute this function even if it's taking long time. And this is done like this because requests for the server could take longer time since they involve communication over the internet. So now after this line of code, we have our response. So first thing we want to do is to check if our response is okay. So if it's not okay, we need to throw an exception or error as called here in JavaScript. And for this error, I want to use this string template here, which will show us the status, only the status of the response. So when we call the physicist root, the response will be returned from us from the server as a JSON string. So now we want to parse this JSON string, and let's save it in a variable called data. And for that, we use this response.json, and this will parse the returned JSON expression and give it to us as an object. Here we want also to use the word await since this function is also asynchronous. Now the data will be a list of objects. Let us make an array of physicists from that, and I will call this a new array, only array, ARR, and let's do it with a new array. And then for each object here in the data, so in the response, we want to push a new physicist to our array of physicists. And for that, we will be using the properties of this object here. Now we already sent the request and we got the response, and then we run our callback since we are in a synchronous function, and we will pass the array of physicists as a parameter for this callback. And now let's return to our fill grid here and use this function getAll. So what we want to do in this fill grid is to call this function getAll, and as our callback, we want to run all this code here. So we want to clear the table and then refill it. So this can be done like this. We just call getAll, and let's write our arrow function expression and call this variable here physicists. Remember, this is the callback. Here we are writing the callback, and the callback will be called here on this array of physicists. That's why I called it here physicists. And then here we will have this arrow function where we will execute all this code here. And that's it. Now we need to close the parenthesis for the getAll function. Let me put it on this line, and let me clean this here. And now notice, so we only have one call, getAll, with everything here as a callback. When we receive the list of physicists back from the server, this function here, this arrow function here will be called with this physicist as an input, and then we can loop here and fill our grid. So that's it. Let me save this here and let's rerun the server. Note that if we only changed client-side code, we don't need to rerun the server. But however, we did not rerun after changing inside this index.js. So we added this root here, and that will not be executed till we rerun again. Now let us test our web page. So let's go back to home. You can see that nothing is being rendered, and that's because some files are missing. Let me press the F12 to bring up the div tools and see all the error which we have. So as you can see here, we have this not found response, so 404, and that's because our physicist.js JavaScript and also the banner.js, there is no route to return these two files. So what's happening is that we are loading our home page, and in our home page, remember in the header here, we have two links, actually three links here. So the web browser will try to fetch those 1, 2, 3 files. And since in our index.js, so in our server, we don't have any response to get those files, nothing will be returned. So the error 404 not found will be returned. And that's what you see here. Yeah? So let us handle this. We need to add routes for that, and let me add it here. Since this has to do with the home page, again we will have get, since the web browser will be sending get request to get these files. And now here I will use a generic string, so I will use gs common. So remember, our physicist is inside this gs common folder here. So I will tell Express that whenever you get something with gs common, whatever comes next, so I will use the star for that. The star represent whatever string comes here. Then please call our response, our function here, which will take, as usual, request and response. Let me write it in the arrow style. And the name of the file will be the first parameter in the request. So let's check for that using if. Then we will check the request params. So those are the parameters. We look to the first parameter, so in the index 0. And if that's not undefined, so if there is a parameter here, we want to send the corresponding file. So we will use res.send file as before. And now the file path will be the first parameter here, since this is how the web browser will send it. And then we will also need this root. And since we know that this should be inside our gs common, we will put the root to gs common. And now if there is no parameter, we'll send an error with an error code 400. That means bad request. And let's also add a similar route for client-side code. So everything inside CS. And the only thing we need to change is also here, this route. Let me save this and rerun the server. Let's check now our page. I'll just do a refresh here. So now we are getting the response back, but we have a client-side error when this code is run. So it's telling us, like inside this failgrid.js, that this physicist has already been declared somewhere. So let's check that. So actually, I don't know how this got here. This is a require command, and this does not belong to the client-side code. Let me delete it. So the class physicist here is included using this script tag here with the corresponding source. And notice now we only changed this failgrid class here, so we don't need to rerun the server because this is a client side. We only need to refresh the page, and that's it. So as you can see, we have our grid rendered correctly. Now clicking on this edit still works because it does not include any communication with the server. Same as for the cancel here, because it's only clear these fields here. However, now the save will give us an error because we did not change it to send the request to the server. Now it's trying directly to call this DB class, which is not defined anymore because we removed it from the client side. I think the same here for the delete. It asks us again, do you want to delete? If I click OK, you see DB is not defined. Let's do these two requests then. And that will be done here inside the home page. So we have this ph delete and ph save. And inside these two functions, we need to tell the server to save or delete the corresponding physicist. So first, let's do the server side. And let's start by save. So for that, we will use posts since we want to change something on the server side. And let's define the URL. And for that, I want the URL to be something like physicist/update. And let's write the callback function, request and response. Here, I also like to use a try catch block. And inside the catch block, so if we have an error, we send again an error message as before. But note here that I'm just using this error.message because I want to display the message. Maybe we can do the same also here. So let's send only the message for the server. And I noticed that here in these two functions, we actually don't have an error defined. This is wrong. So let me just add bad request. Sorry for the confusion. Yeah. So and now inside this try block, we want to do the following. First, we define a new physicist, which will come from our request body. So in the body of the request, we will send the data of the physicist. That's why I'm using request.body. And then this body will contain only one physicist. So we will have .name, .birth year, birthplace, and comments. So now we can define a physicist, and then we call simply db.update. And that's it. Now we can send response to the client, to the web browser, and this response will have the 200, which means successful, and inside the body we'll just send done. That's it for the update. For the delete, we will have something similar. Let me paste the code for that. So as you can see, we start with the root. So we'll use here physicist delete, and then we have our function or callback where we get the physicist from the request body and then call the delete on the database and send the response back to the client. So let me save, and now let's call these two services from the corresponding function here. So save from ph.save. So notice now inside ph.save, we were clearing the banner, then we constructing a physicist, and then we were calling this update on the DB and then updating our web page. So updating our web page will stay the same, and also everything above this db.update will stay the same. The only thing need to change is this line here, and that need to be replaced by a call to the server. And we will be using the fetch function as before. But however, before I do that, I want to define the request options because the default was get and previously we were using get. So we didn't need to define those options. However, now we need to change this to post. So let's do that. So I will define const, let's say reqops, and then this should be a JavaScript object. Inside this object, we will define one property called method, and we'll give it the value post. If we did not define this, the default would be get, as I said, and then I will also define headers, and the headers will tell the server some information about our content. So for here, I will use content type, and we will use JSON in the body. So the content type will be application/JSON. And for the body of our request, as we've seen in the server, I will put the physicist as a JSON string. And for that, I will use JSON.stringify. And this function will take a Java object or a class. In this case, we will be using our current physicist, so ph current, which is defined here. This function stringify will make a JSON string from this and assign to this property body. And now we can do our post call to the server. So we will use fetch, and for the address, we need to use the same address which we defined in the route, which is physicist update. And then we will pass the options, which we call reqopt, and that's it here. And of course, after we get our response, we want to check if it's okay. So if it's not okay, again, we throw an exception. And if it's okay, then we do nothing. So this line here will be called. So we'll be adding an info and then filling our grid. Notice now, since we used this await, we need to make this function async. And let me save. Now let's do the delete. Similar to the update, the only thing we need to change is this call to the DB, and we need to replace it call to the server. Let me paste the code for that. So notice that we are again defining the options as before. Then we are calling the delete route with the options which we already created, and again checking our response here. And since we are using await, we need to change this function to async. Let me save. And now let's test this. So since we already did also some server side changes, we need to rerun the server. And now in the web browser, let's refresh. Let's try the delete and let's click OK. We want to delete. And we have an exception here. ph current is not found. Let's check that here inside the delete. So we are using this ph current here, but it's not defined anywhere. And that's the cause of the problem, because I changed this code from the update function. Let's solve this by simply defining a constant ph current, and it's a physicist. We only have a name here in the delete. So let me take that. Oh, actually this delete is getting the whole physicist, and we only need the name since the delete will be done using the name. So let's take the ph.name, and then everything else will be null. Let me save and refresh the page since we only changed the client-side code. And let's try to delete this physicist here. It seems that we are getting a weird response here, 400 with deleted. Refresh. It seems it is deleted, but I don't know why we got this exception. Let me check. So maybe inside this function delete. Notice that here when we are deleting, I'm throwing an exception, which is weird. Let me delete this line here. So now we will throw exception only if we did not find the name of the physicist. Let me save. And now since this is a server-side code, we need to rerun the server. And let us now refresh the page. So since we rerun the server, as you can see, we are back to 3 physicists in the list, the default. And let me try to delete this one. Now we get an info that the physicist is deleted, but we are again getting this DB is not defined. I think we already also forgot something inside the delete function here. So the fill function here, we still are using this db.all, So I need to remove that. And since also in the update we are doing the same, I assume we still have this db.all inside update here. So let me remove it to avoid that when we call the update and save. And yeah, now this is only client-side code, so we don't need to rerun the server. Let's just refresh the web page. And since the server is still running, no matter how we click refresh, we have the updated list. So only 2 physicists are there. Let me now click delete, and you can see we have a correct message here and the grid is updated. And let's try now the update, and let's put information of a physicist and then click save. And you can see that the physicist is already been added. It's now clear and add another one and click save. And you can see now we have 3 physicists. If we refresh, we still have them no matter how much we do that, since the server is still running. That's all what I wanted to show in this tutorial. And please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.